continued? How have people coped? What's the situation? What are the fear levels? What's the emotion of all of us? How is it affecting us in the medium term, perhaps even the long term? What are the intentions of government and corporations and other forces? What's the future going to be after COVID-19? If there is there ever going to be an after COVID-19, or is this virus going to come back over and over again? It's thrown up all sorts of fascinating questions for me, and certainly for people like Peter Hitchens, who's a well-known writer on the Daily Mail. He expresses huge doubts in terms of the civil liberties which are being gnawed at, and the way that the establishment is quite clearly using COVID-19 also for its own advantage in terms of pushing through several agendas which previously would perhaps have been unthinkable. Mandatory vaccinations, for one, is definitely on the agenda, and people may quite willingly go ahead with it. People not even having personal relationships the way they used to have is already emerging with the social distancing concept. On a global scale, the economy is clearly going to take a massive whack, probably one of the worst recessions looming, and that in itself has huge implications for our lives beyond the virus. How many people will die because of the consequences of the wave we've reacted to COVID-19 is one of the questions that is in my mind, whereas of course most of us are probably just worried about here and now and keeping safe and doing the safe thing. But is doing the safe thing actually going to cause more harm than good in the medium and long term, perhaps even in the immediate here and now as well? With me on the show to discuss these and many other issues, to bring up different angles, to help us question and inquire more deeply, is Clive Menzies from Outer Sight. And
good evening, Mohsin. Good to be here.
Thank you for joining us. And Maulana Syed Muhammad Razavi, as ever, here to give us his perspectives. Maulana, welcome to the show.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you. And so without any further ado, I'm going to turn to you, Clive, and just to give us, set the scene. We've been away from this for 4 or 5 weeks. I think maybe 5, 6 weeks ago, you and I did a program. Maulana was with us as well on one of the shows, and we talked about the potential implications of COVID-19 then. But a lot has unfolded. So first of all, your overview of what's, if you like, this kind of what's going on with the virus mania, as one book that you introduced me to calls it, virus mania. What is all this all about in the immediate? And then perhaps as we go along, we can also weave in solutions, because we don't want to just add to what the fear that mainstream media and government have engendered. Perhaps we want to also give people some ideas, some hope, and some sort of vision where they can control what the future should be after COVID-19. But your overview.
Thank you, Mohsin. The thing is that one has to look at the longer term trajectory in order to get an understanding of what's happening in the current. And the reason I recommended that book, Virus Mania, is that if you look back in history, the idea of viruses and vaccines only really took hold in the 19th century. And while there is some validity in the process of immunization through vaccination, what seems to have happened is that has morphed into a sort of catch-all remedy for things that are very natural, our development. So that's the sort of longer term perspective. And if the main agenda or the main weapon that's been used on us all to implement what is being implemented is fear, and fear of coronavirus specifically. And I would urge everyone to read that book, because once you understand the context that our bodies are highly complex and diseases are caused by many multiple factors, not least diet and lifestyle, but until you actually understand that, then you remain fearful because you think there's one single cause, and if we don't get a vaccine for it, we're doomed. Whereas the reality is that if you live a reasonably healthy, balanced lifestyle, then your immune system will remain robust. Whereas vaccinations have been proven to actually cause immunization depletion, if you like, or weakness. So I think the big question of what's really been happening over the last month or so is not so much the sort of day-to-day news of, you know, whether Dominic Cummings broke his lockdown. It's much more about how much has the fear taken hold and how much has this familiarity or habitual compliance with authority, how much is that now ingrained in the populace in a way that, if not irreversible, it's going to take a lot to actually allay people's fears and get them to realize that they've been lied to consistently from the time this started.
Okay. Well, we're having a slight problem with Clive's sound. I'm sure studio will fix that. But I got the gist of it. And for those who perhaps didn't hear, Clive talked about broader solutions than just vaccinating people and actually having, if you like, a more balanced lifestyle and improving the immunization, the natural immunity systems through good living, good lifestyle. It's a really strong theme from a Muslim point of view, from an Islamic point of view, from a prophetic lifestyle point of view. That really resonates with me for a start, because we've been arguing for a very long time that the society that we have is fundamentally flawed in the way that we've constructed, the way we produce, consume. In fact, most of it is wrong. But this is interesting how COVID-19 seems to also be kind of indicating that to those who've got some deeper research. Maulana, let me bring the spiritual side of things in, because it brings up fear and of course depression and fear and demoralization are things that we're familiar with within certainly the Muslim community, where we've had the counter-terror policies and the whole narrative about the war on terror, which has been imposed for the last 2 decades upon mainly Muslim communities, and the stress and the pressure of that has been definitely visible, and it has impacts on the way we behave and the way we respond. In an interesting way, one of the other articles that I'd come across talked about how COVID-19 is kind of almost an extension of that same tactic, but has achieved much bigger results. That because of counter-terrorism, I think the average person didn't still feel that we could do away with our civil liberties completely and sort of hand over our personal, if you like, liberties on the scale that people seem to be accepting now. What's your overview of the whole virus mania at the moment? Where do you take on this? Because I know that in the Islamic Republic of Iran they took it seriously, and eventually they shut down shrines. Only reopened today, I think, or yesterday. They also did all the social distancing, and there are many other countries like Norway, for instance, like Iceland, Japan, who actually have now gone back to normal. They had very minimal deaths, hardly any. So there's been a lot of virus mania where everything gets locked down, everybody's in total fear, you've got to do all these extraordinary distancing measures. Haven't really been advised in some of these other countries, and it's been successful. But where do you come off in terms of the whole spiritual perspective and how to defend our immune systems from fear? Because fear in itself, it's said, creates a weakening of the immune system. That if Syed Razavi can hear me.
Sound quality is very low. I don't know. I'm trying to understand what you said. I would like to mention that from his point of view, Islamic teachings, if you look at the supplications and du'as, we have du'as for pandemics, we have du'as for extreme circumstances, and our noble leaders, I mean, the divine leaders had prepared us for a situation like that, that when we are going through difficulties and problems, we should recite certain du'as and be for it. So there is no reason, of course, there is a reason to be afraid, scared, and we should take care of the restrictions and necessary precautions that are introduced by the local authorities does not contradict with that as well. But at the same time, we should always try to educate our community members that we belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, are from Him, and we do return to Him. And we are here in this world. We have to fulfill our duty, responsibility towards, first of all, ourselves and the environment and the creations of God on this planet Earth. And maybe these kind of pandemics occasionally after a few years are kind of a reminder that how weak we are, how strong is the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are blaming, we should be careful. We are not blaming Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for any of these illnesses or pandemics, because most of these illnesses and pandemics are to our own misconduct and misbehavior and misuse and abuse of the science and technology that is available at our hands. Here with the nature, and these are the results that happened. Remember, a few years ago we had mad cow disease. Again, the mad cow disease was due to, according to the scientists, they tried to feed a vegetarian animal some product, and just with the quality of the meat, or maybe they increased the quality, the amount of the milk. So we as the human beings, we interfere in the system. This is the result of it.
Sounds like I've just lost Maulana as well. We are having some trouble with sound. I do hope that you'll kind of bear with us. We will try and make sure that we get Maulana back as well if he's gone. But Clive, are you still with us? If you can hear me, I wanted to just take
I can
up,
hear you.
well, perhaps you might want to. Oh, great, I can hear you. So perhaps you might want to carry on from where you were cut off, because you may have had more to say. But if not, then I've got a question for you. I don't know whether you remember the strand of where you were before we had to interject.
Well, I had sort of come to a natural end, but I think Maulana has raised an interesting point.
Okay,
that yes,
good.
These pandemics are or maybe of our own making. But I think the point about the book I was making is that there is a pandemic industry, and this book actually tracks from the whole circus that evolved around AIDS and HIV, followed by SARS, swine flu, BSE, and all these various pandemics. And I've studied some of the more recent ones like Ebola, and there was another one recently as well, which will come to me. And when you look at the collusion between the various authorities, there is an actual industrial process to create the illusion of pandemics, which never exist. Because I was actually reading today about Edward Jenner and the development of vaccinations for smallpox using cowpox pustule to immunize people. And the thing is, whilst there may be some validity in vaccination, it's become a catch-all and a substitute for many other issues that are actually causing illness. And so we're talking about the electronic frequencies within which we live now, which are unnatural and potentially damaging. It's the amount of modification to foods and water and things that we ingest that may well be contributing to illness and suppressing our immune systems. Because this is not so much about the pandemics as our immune systems. And the problem with what is being applied in terms of lockdown and in terms of mandatory, if it becomes vaccination, all of these are detrimental to your immune system. And therefore, if you're wearing a mask, you're rebreathing a lot of the stuff that you would normally expel into the fresh air. And your state of mind is as much responsible for your immune system as anything else. You hear stories about people who are ill who either give up on life or fight back. Well, that's very much to do with your psyche. And if your psyche is in constant fear, then you're in constant stress. And that is clearly debilitating from a health point of view as well as a psychological point of view.
Well, they're fascinating points you raised, and one I'd like to pick up on, which at a slight tangent, is this idea of trust in medicine and trust in science. One of the things that's come out of this is the contradictions of scientists amongst each other, and then the selection of politically correct scientists, or the allegation that governments, corporations will always pick scientists who will rubber stamp what they want said or done, and then these establishment authorities, bodies, will tend to do things and justify things in the minds of the public, especially if the media is not there to pull them up. And it does seem as though our media here in the West seems to be very reluctant to present argument, counter-argument. Certainly within this COVID-19 scenario, there was absolutely no coverage really entertained for any counter-narrative other than lockdown. It was feverish. And only now I think the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail have started squeaking, but that's to a certain audience. And we've got this split within society and yet another division about people who are, completely disgusted by those who don't care about lockdown and actually want their freedom and civil liberties, and those who are saying, no, the health of society is far more important than our civil liberties. Should it be a choice of either or? And is science and politics mixing in order to confuse people as a result of this COVID? Is this one example?
Well, look, we've talked on many occasions about the structural nature of our problems. And we came up with the three fundamental flaws, the first of which is institutional hierarchy. And the problem is, and we produced a paper last year called Gulag Academia, which actually explains with copious references why science and academia in general is in crisis, because hierarchy suppresses any feedback that would alert us to problems with any particular aspect of science. That is always suppressed. So one only gets the positive spin on whatever the agenda may be. So when it comes down to the science of coronavirus, it's built on the back of this whole pandemic mythology that has grown up over the last 120 odd years. But it actually builds its own specific narrative, which is quite contradictory and many-layered. And within that, there are significant scientific voices of dissent, both those who believe in the concept of the virus, but believe that herd immunity is vastly more efficient in suppressing the spread of disease than anything else. But then you have a fewer in number, if you like, maverick scientists who are saying that we're talking about the wrong thing. This is not COVID-19. I mean, the way I look at it is, if you look at COVID, it stands for Certificate of Vaccination ID. Now, that's advertised in plain sight. And you may say that's just that's coincidence, but there are so many coincidences, not least that the UK government actually downgraded this as a high consequence infectious disease on the 19th of March. And yet implemented the lockdown 4 days later. So there is no doubt that if you look at where the science, the so-called science, because there's no such thing as the science, there are lots of different scientific opinions built on various perspectives, but none of them are, if you like, comprehensively the reality. And therefore, if you look at where the Imperial study came from, Gates has funded that outfit for the tune of, I think it's something like approaching $70 million. He's also funded another unit in Oxford for millions of dollars. And these are the people who are advising our government. And then you've got Bill Gates lining up with the government co-investing in all sorts of things. And that's just in the UK. But the Gates Foundation tentacles are enmeshed in society. They've been immunizing women in Africa as a pretext for a mass sterilization program. They've been kicked out of India for vaccination programs that actually were killing people. And so, you know, you've got this sort of tentacle of medical malpractice, for want of a better way of putting it, permeating the whole of Orthodox society. Not to mention the fact that if you look at UK column, BBC and various units within BBC, the World Service and Media Action have been funded to the tune of $70 million by the Gates Foundation also. So the media are similarly controlled to the scientific establishment. All roads lead to money power at the end of the day.
Well, this is again a concern. I'll bring Maulana into this, but what you raise here, we need to take a bit of a deep breath here, because we used to be aware in the old days about conflict of interest. So politicians, bankers, corporations, and if you like, media were not really, it was frowned upon publicly for them to have any links. But now we've openly got people like Matt Hancock who's got links to companies that are pitching on the health side. Yet he's the head of the health policy here, and you've got Bill Gates, who's buddies with as many politicians as you like. Bill Gates also not only influences, funds WHO, the World Health Organization, which is really a private establishment or setup or body, which could arguably and very, very comfortably, you could argue that it's actually representing big pharma interests. So I think what you've raised is really important, that if scientists can be in the pocket of money men, if politicians can be in the pockets of the same money men, and if big pharma is serving the same profit for the money men, and at the same time you've got, the governments and the media, then we've got a problem. As a public, it means that what information we're getting is highly, if you like, compromised potentially with the financial interests of a small elitist set of institutions or people, individuals. Maulana, this is just one of the spin-off problems that COVID-19 has highlighted even more. Of course, activists like myself and others and Clive, we've kind of known about this a long time. But now people, the ordinary masses, are getting in connection with how that's impacting them. One of the other areas, I mean, you can comment on anything that Clive said as well. I'm happy for you to come in with anything you've picked up from the conversation. But specifically, one of the things that was also happening as a result of COVID-19 is that other major issues in the world have been ignored. So, for instance, the pressure on Iran and the war on Iran by Israel and America, which has been hotting up, hasn't gone away. That seems to have escalated. Yet COVID-19 has provided a perfect storm, a perfect cover for it. You've got other examples of, tensions around the world. China and the economic meltdown that's going on between the US and China. That's also happening quietly. What's your feeling about the impact of other global problems and people being blindsided because they're so paranoid about COVID-19 that they're not focusing and seeing what's going on in terms of other major threats to the world, perhaps even world wars, or certainly economic trade wars?
Well, if they are planning to introduce the so-called vaccine, as Brother Clive mentioned, then of course they would try to brush all other problem carpet and or maybe take advantage of the pandemic and do some of the activities around the world at the same time. But we have to be alert and know that we should not lose concentration on COVID-19 and its plot that the government and Bill Gates and others are trying to impose on the people. And at the same time, we should not ignore the ongoing issues and problems around the world. So maybe the enemy is trying to use one arrow for targets at the same time. So, and according to some narrations, one of the signs of Akhir Zaman, end of the world, is that people need to be more alert and aware of what's going around themselves. And it is our responsibility, scholars' responsibility, spiritual leaders' responsibility to keep this awareness amongst the people so they can have a say in their own future, in the world's future, and not let the so-called powers and few families that who want to run the world and run economic system of the world. Although at the same time, while all of this is going on, we are witnessing some major development in the world. For example, recently Iran managed to do barter exchange with Venezuela, like instead of using dollars and foreign currency, they took gold from Venezuela, supplied oil to Venezuela, and also at the same time broke the sanctions. Both countries broke the sanctions from both. I mean, America had imposed sanctions on Iran, and at the same time had imposed sanctions on Venezuela. And Venezuela requested oil, although Venezuela itself is an oil-producing country, but because of the sanction, Venezuela is suffering. So they needed some external help, and Iran was willing to provide. And Iran also is suffering from sanctions, so they wanted to boost their economic conditions, and certainly importing gold would have and will have some kind of effect. Clive would elaborate more on this subject, as he's very keen on these economical side of these activities taking place around the world.
Yeah, Clive, I mean, just the last 3 minutes, final word goes to you in this part of our program. We will return with Critical Eye to carry on the discussion about the future and the consequences, and perhaps also to empower people with what we should really be doing and where we should really be focusing. We started touching on it, but I'm sure we can go further. So your conclusion in this part of the program, what is it that, if you like, is the end game for many of these, if you like, establishments? What would the establishment see as a benefit from COVID-19? And is there any indication that they're actually trying to take advantage of it for the benefit of the rich and the wealthy, the elites, the political institutions, and the powers that be? Is there something going on, do you think?
Well, undoubtedly, COVID-19 or coronavirus or the pandemic, whatever you want to describe it as, is the gift that keeps on giving. I was alerted today the fact that China is revving up for war because there's this increasing tension over was China responsible, and I've read quite a lot in the sort of alt media in America that there's this sort of division between China and America. The fact that both are controlled by the same forces doesn't seem to enter many people's heads. So the agenda is unfolding, and I think largely the agenda has been proven to be quite effective, not least because of the number of people who've agreed to self-isolate and social distance and basically abide by the regulations. I heard a government minister or backbencher, I can't remember, or maybe he was returning to the backbenches, saying that, we follow the rules, why shouldn't you, in respect of Dominic Cummings? Well, where does this idea of following rules of lunacy come from? And it comes from this whole miasma, misinformation and fear mongering that is wholly unjustified by the evidence, but it's been obscured. So in terms of where they're going, the aim is to have a population under control. They seem to have managed to perform the trick for a large number of people to get them willingly to comply with whatever is imposed on them, however ridiculous and inconsistent it may seem. And if you contrast this with Soviet Russia, where very similar conditions applied, although in different circumstances, but most of the people who lived in the Soviet Union had a very clear understanding that most of what they were told officially was nonsense, but they just weren't allowed to say so because there were too many risks from being shot to the police or whatever. But everybody knew that all that was painted in the media or by the state wasn't true. Whereas we're in a completely different state where people believe everything.
Well, thank you for that, Clive, and thank you, Maulana. We'll be right back after a break. Do rejoin us when we will actually try and continue dissecting things, because I still haven't uncovered everything that I wanted to deal with in terms of the virus mania and how it's kind of impacting us. But the solutions are really important. We'll try and hopefully